Can I ask, when you say it'll be recorded, what do you plan to do with it?
We hope to share on our website to be able to let other people later hear about who say weren't able to join us today but had signed up to the event to be able to hear Maria's talk.
Fine.
Okay, so I'm just going to so first of all, I'll just start by giving a little introduction to Bell House. Bell House is an educational charity that focuses on wider learning, learning in the widest sense of the word. It champions education outside of the mainstream classroom and lifelong learning. And it's based in a lovely Georgian house in Dulwich, which is ideally where we'd be tonight, but seeing as that's not an option right now, we're online, and we're very glad that you're all able to join us. As this talk had originally scheduled to be in person, in place tonight, but we've shifted with the times, and so we're very glad you could all still join us this evening. Tonight's talk works into one of Bell House's core focuses, which is dyslexia support and awareness. Bell House has lots of different projects, but the dyslexia support was one of its founding projects, and there are many people who are very passionate at Bell House about improving the perspective of dyslexic students and their parents, teachers, and carers. And so we're very grateful tonight to have Maria Nikitidou, who is a pianist and educator, who's here to talk to us about music and dyslexia. Maria is currently working as a curriculum music teacher at primary school, as well as a private piano tutor. After years of working with students with SEND, Maria started her own research project that's currently ongoing about piano and dyslexia. And she's planning to develop her research further from a neuroscience perspective by pursuing studies at Goldsmiths through their master's program in music, mind and brain. And so we're very excited to have Maria with us tonight, and I'm going to hand over to her, and over to you, Maria.
Hello everyone, thank you for this introduction, Abby, very much. First of all, I would like to thank Bell House for hosting this talk today. I actually got very excited the other day when I heard that so many tickets were booked, and it's so lovely to see so many of you being here today, even virtually. So thank you all for showing interest in my little project. The Music and Dyslexia project started officially in 2019 during my master's studies at Trinity London, but the idea was initiated much earlier than that, while I was working as an SEND teacher in East London. So during this period, I was working closely with dyslexia specialists and students with dyslexia in the mainstream class, watching their progress and their struggles of those students that have had from mild to severe dyslexia made me realize two things. First of all, how can we teach music, and especially the piano, as a pianist myself, to a student that struggles to read a three-letter word? How can we really adjust our lessons so that the student with dyslexia can not only access music, but also succeed in reading music independently? And my second thought was actually a big realization. I started recognizing that in the past, especially in the early years of my teaching experience, I have taught pupils without realizing that had some form of dyslexia or some dyslexic traits, or at least that was never mentioned to me by the parents or anyone else. So these two thoughts, in addition to the fact that we see so many artists and so many musicians saying that they are dyslexic, made me want to research how musical learning can be successful for pupils with dyslexia. So all this but most importantly, because I strongly believe, as I've got on the quote on the first slide, that the doors must be open to anyone that wants to learn music, and it's the obligation of every music teacher to pass this knowledge on. All those made me start this project. I often hear the question if I am dyslexic myself, and people probably think that I get quite passionate about the project because I can relate in a personal level. The truth is that I'm not. I even got myself assessed when I started this project. However, as probably all of us, I sometimes find myself showing some traits. For example, I most of the times get confused with right and left. I even now sometimes think about trembling face in order to say right and left. And also, due to the underdevelopment of music education, unfortunately, in my home country, Greece, at least when I was a student, when I moved here to study in the conservatoire, I found myself struggling in some areas that my other friends at the conservatoire didn't. And actually trying those resources and tips that I've read that help dyslexic students helped me as well, even if I wasn't. So the main goal of this project and this talk as well is to raise awareness around dyslexia and how it can affect musical learning, and provide some support both for the teachers and the students as well. So first, we're going to start with, oops, the share is not working, I think. One more time. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see my next slide?
Sorry, Maria, I think we're okay. I think if you click resume, we should be okay.
What about now? Can you see my first slide?
Second slide, okay.
Second slide, great.
Yeah.
So first of all, we're going to start about what dyslexia is, very briefly. The word comes originally from Greek, and it means difficulties with words or with language in general. If we break the word down, this for Greek is a prefix that means difficulty, and lexis or lexi in modern Greek means word. The condition was first recognized about 130 years ago in patients with acquired aphasia by Kusamel in 1887. And dyslexia was the first general term, just an umbrella term, used to describe various learning problems. And because of this, it's sometimes called the mother of learning difficulties. It has actually been calculated that there are about 40 subtraits of dyslexia. It's also surprising that even educationalists have considered dyslexia only in relation to reading, writing, and spelling for a very long time. Most recently, it's recognized in the field of mathematics as dyscalculia, and also in music as dysmusia. Now, moving on, some definitions about dyslexia. There have been many different ones, and unfortunately, there is still, even today, no universally accepted definition, and it's likely to remain so until someone discovers its root cause. Some people actually think that it can't be defined at all, and I've read somewhere a really nice comparison that dyslexia is as hard to define as music. You can find all the different elements, but it's hard to define it as a whole for everyone, which also includes the fact that both music and dyslexia are very personal. Not all dyslexics struggle in the same areas. As you can see on your slide, you can see the definition we've got about dyslexia from the Department for Education. I recite the exact same words there. Therefore, according to this definition, which is quite general, I think, if you have a student struggling in areas such as reading, writing, spelling, or numbers, but that doesn't reflect his or her general abilities, you should stay alert that dyslexia might be present. Additionally to this, we should be aware that dyslexia might co-occur with other learning difficulties, but those two terms, specific learning difficulties and dyslexia, shouldn't be synonymous. The only clear definition and distinction that we have so far is the one between acquired and developmental dyslexia. And today we're going to focus on the developmental dyslexia, which is probably genetically determined. Are we okay so far? Can you give me thumbs up if it's okay for me to move on? Any questions about the definitions? Great. Now, in the next slides, I have added some facts and misconceptions about dyslexia that I come across and I found them quite interesting. To me, the most important is the last one on the first slide, that dyslexia is not cured. However, with appropriate teaching methods, dyslexics can learn successfully. I've heard that many times. Some people say that see adults with dyslexia that are coping with the difficulties really well, and they say that they kind of grew out of it. The truth is that this is actually impossible. However, they have probably explored and developed the ways and the skills that actually work for them. I can see someone raised their hand. If you don't mind, could you pop in the question into the chat and we can talk about it after. Thank you. Now, if you have a look on the second one, what I found interesting is that 74% of the teachers surveyed did not feel satisfied that their initial teacher training provided them with the skills they needed to identify and teach dyslexics. But, well, if you ask me, I don't think that my initial teacher training barely prepared me for any of the things I've seen around schools, to be honest. Now, moving on, we're going to see some of the primary symptoms about dyslexia, except from the discrepancy between intelligence and the ability to learn basic literary skills that we've seen in the definitions. In the following slides, there are some of the primary symptoms that show us that dyslexia might be present. First difficulties are auditory, which are mainly language-based and include slowness in processing what is heard, inability to recognize rhyme, and inability to recognize and manipulate segmentation and blending, which are the most important, which is why we see really poor reading and spelling in dyslexics. Second type of difficulties are the visual ones that include inability to maintain fixed focus, inability to maintain steady directional progress while you're reading, susceptibility to glare and the effect that stripes can have, and lack of competence in recognition of similarities and differences both in text and shapes. Third difficulty, spatial difficulties, which is one of the most common, confusion between left and right, or even up and down, and inability to judge the distance, which sometimes comes across as a general clumsiness. Fourth difficulty is memory. Both visual and auditory memory can be deficient in short term. However, when we have new knowledge in the long-term memory, it can most of the time be secure. And the last one is disorganization. We all know that child that finds it really hard to organize themselves, their equipment, their books and notebooks, but also the method that they work. If you see the writing, they just say different ideas without being able to organize them in a text. Now, except from the primary symptoms of dyslexia, we've got some secondary ones that mostly come as a result of the primary ones. First one, poor concentration, can be a consequence of not being sure on what they are meant to be concentrating, or because the messages or the instructions are really quick for them to process. Second one, poor coping skills as a result of the poor visual memory and short-term memory as well, because sometimes they don't even remember what they're meant to be copying. Anxiety and low self-esteem, as the child is often aware of their struggles and they become really worried about their performance or about making mistakes in front of the friends and the adults around. Frustration, especially after struggling with persistent difficulties again and again. Family problems, especially if the child doesn't receive the help needed or if the parents are not even aware about their dyslexia, which is very often. And last one, erratic behavior, which means that one day their performance might be amazing and the next day on the same task, it might seem impossible for them to do it. Now, how do all those affect musical learning? I think it's actually obvious for all of us that both primary symptoms and the secondary symptoms affect any learning in a great deal. Now let's try to think about all those in a scenario of an instrumental lesson. First of all, the auditory. This can apply to any verbal instruction that the teacher gives, any speech, any talking, any singing. Also, sometimes if there are auditory difficulties, the processing speed might be different in the different ears. I'll try to describe this very simple. It might sound a bit oversimplifying, but generally it's considered that the rhythm is controlled by the left side of the brain and the pitch, melody, tonality by the right side of the brain. However, if we want a really good musical performance, we really need both of those sides to coordinate perfectly, unless our music is purely percussive, so we've got just rhythm. So if the auditory messages from the different ears are not processed in the same speed, then we start having issues. Also, any language difficulties can cause reading issues with reading the title of the piece, reading any instructions on the book, recognizing note names, getting confused with B and D, or even learning the Italian terms that we often use in music. Second, the visual difficulties may result in skipping beats, skipping notes, skipping even whole bars, and rests, which is the most common, finding hard to read from the stave, as we've got many lines and we can have this visual effect that the lines do, recognizing if the note is on the line, if it's on the space, and finding hard to recognize any patterns or any shapes or any musical pattern that is repeated throughout the piece. Third one, special difficulties. Confusion between left and right, especially for pianists. It's very hard for them to decide which hand they have to play and what. And also, any special difficulties can also be described as finding hard to judge distance. So it's hard for them to decide how close or how far they're sitting from their instrument or how they're going to hold the instrument. Also, judging the distance on the keyboard or judging intervals on the score or the instrument and discovering, exploring the whole geography of the instrument as well, where the sounds are low and where the sounds are high. Memory difficulties, the deficiencies in both visual and auditory memory can make it harder for the kinesthetic memory to establish any new knowledge. And we can all agree that this affects the learning a new piece, memorizing it, being able to practice it, but also being able to sight read really quick. All the disorganization issues come down to all the things that we need for the lesson. All our books, our notebooks. We can see dyslexics going for a music lesson without having any instruments, as well as remembering what day, what time, and where the lesson is, or what they had to practice and how. Now, for the secondary symptoms, I think it's quite obvious for all of us how they can affect any type of learning, and especially any performance. We have all heard about the performance anxiety and all those effects that low self-esteem can have on the students. Now, in music, music and dyslexia is a new area of research. And there has been very little clinical research on the effect that music can have on the dyslexic pupil. However, this is why it has retained its original meaning in music as well, as the one of being a specific learning difficulty in handling information that is coded in a different format. The only difference now is that the format is a musical score. Therefore, in music, there's a focus on reading musical notation and sight reading. However, do you think that those two are the only most important aspects of musical learning? I would honestly really like to hear your views regarding this in the end of the session. And if you'd like, you can start popping in questions already. So far, we have discussed about what dyslexia is, some of the definitions and the facts. We have described some of the main difficulties and the symptoms of dyslexia, and we have briefly looked into how it can affect musical learning, and especially learning an instrument. Now, as I'm a pianist myself, the research I've done so far focused on learning the piano. So the next step I did for this, I examined the reality of the piano lessons by sharing a questionnaire with piano teachers from around the world. If you are interested, you can look through the full research and the outcomes on pianoandmore.com in the piano and dyslexia section. Today, I'm going to focus only on some of those outcomes that I found the most crucial. You can see the first two questions on the next slide. With those first two questions, we can see that there's some moderate understanding of dyslexia amongst the piano teachers, which is actually quite positive. And we can also see that the majority of the piano teachers agreed that dyslexia does affect musical learning a lot. Additionally, on the next two questions, moving on, we can see that most of the teachers do or have taught students with dyslexia. And on the next one also, that they found that they did have some particular difficulties while teaching them. Now, the most important question for me, the most interesting one, was the next one, which examines which were the areas that those students struggled with. Let's have a look more specifically. You can see that notation has got 44%, and then different motor and hand coordination difficulties were the most common as well. That's why today I'm going to focus on those two aspects of learning the piano. So, for notation, which predictably was the more common one, you can see on the right side of the slide some of the problems as the teachers described them. We have to remember first that ever since the later half of the 20th century, the musical performance changed the focus from the ear to a very careful interpretation of the score. I remember really clearly when I was studying in the conservatoire, all our teachers were focusing on how vigilant we have to be on every little detail we find in the score, and how we have to find the right addition with the right details so that we can copy those. However, to my view, and that's honestly personal, Musical progress should not be limited only to the reading ability. Any melodic, rhythmical, kinesthetic, and oral memory can be developed by rote learning as well. I can imagine, though, that while teaching beginners, we all choose a nice beginner's book, and most of our pupils do expect it and want it in front of them on the piano, and actually quite enjoy it because they've got really nice pictures and colors and stickers. However, for a dyslexic student, we can imagine that there are many difficulties with this book. First one, as we mentioned before, the lines and the staves. We've got 5 lines, 10 for the pianists especially. And if we start thinking about how we could best support them in reading the stave, I think it's quite interesting to look at the history of it since Gaudio D'Arezzo in the 19th century, in the 11th century, excuse me, came up with it. So we have to note that the first stave had different colors to highlight different pitch, which is something that many dyslexics find very useful. Also, think about the first pieces that we've got in a beginner's book. All of them start with middle C. However, the leg line that middle C has seems to be really unhelpful for the dyslexic student because it adds an extra line other than those 10 that they can already see. Also, after they learn that middle C has got the leg line, I've noticed that any other note they see with the leg line in between is C after that. Not to mention the confusion between C on the right hand and C on the left hand that looks the same, and especially the extra confusion when the stems start getting involved, and we've got stems going down and stems going up, and we've got that C and the other C. Some teachers have actually found very useful starting with E instead of C, which is actually in the middle of the piano as well. Some others that I've talked with find it useful to start teaching with a single line, and they find it less confusing. If you have a look on the next slide on the left, instead of using the first picture that has got C, D, C, and B on the right and left hand, they use a second version that doesn't have the stave line, so all the notes move into one line. Some teachers found that very useful. What I think is that we could definitely reduce the visuals of this if we cover the top 3 lines of the right hand and the 3 bottom lines of the left hand, like creating an envelope window for them to look. And additionally, if we start teaching both Cs on the right and left hand at the same time, it's very useful to create a bigger space between right and left hand stave. I sometimes either cut them down, cut them around, and stick them in a bigger piece of paper so that the gap between right and left is actually really big, really huge. Also, for stave teaching, I found quite useful using a floor stave, and most of the times I start with 3 lines preferably. I leave about 30 centimeters gap between the lines, and the pupil can experience standing on the stave, standing on the lines, standing on the spaces, trying to do steps and skips so that they can see the intervals between the notes. And for pianists as well, the floor stave can be used as practicing fingering as well. So we can ask them, for example, which finger would you play the note that you're standing on? Which one is the next finger if you do a step? Which finger would you use if you did a skip after the note that you're standing on? And something like that. There's also actually a lot of research around the eye function and visual stress. If you have a look on the left side of the slide, this is how a score looks like to someone with visual stress. And it's quite popular, the opinion that color does help to reduce that. Either if we use overlays, if we use highlighters, or if we photocopy the score onto a colored paper. The most popular shades for this are either blue, yellow, green, and purple. But be careful on that. So please let your students choose, because a different color, the wrong color, can be actually counterproductive. Not all dyslexics prefer yellow. That's the most important, because I can hear that quite a lot. It's a very popular opinion, especially around classrooms. I use this yellow background because I've got a dyslexic student in my classroom, which is not always the case. When I've tried overlays, for example, I found that reading with blue overlay was the quickest for me. I could read very quick, but if I had yellow, I was much slower. It didn't really help me. Now, except from the lines on the notes and the lines on the staves, we've got many sorts of other lines on the score. We've got stems, we've got repeats and bar lines, we've got phrasing lines as well. Some quick tips that I've used for the stems, especially because most of the times the dyslexics think that when the stem is down, the note is lower than the one that the stem goes up, or they get confused with which side the stem should be, like when they get confused with B's and D's and P's and Q's. I normally say to them that left is for low, right is for rise, and I give them loads of exercise where they have to add their own stems. That's the only way I found that helps them. And with repeats, if they know what the symbol means, but they think that adding an arrow might help them, then that's fine. But sometimes if a dyslexic has very poor short-term memory, we find them going on a loop, going to the second repeat and then back again, and then back again, and not remembering if they have played the repeat before. So if that's the case, I find it easier to just copy the second repeat in the score and not having the repeat symbol at all. Phrasing lines as well, that's another sort of line that can cause distractions. If we have felt the phrases and we have discussed with our students about what the phrases are, if we have danced them, we have felt them with any kinesthetic way, I prefer to take them off from the score so that that doesn't cause any more stress to them. Or we add some small symbol, like a small breath in the end that they can remember them. But if they feel the phrasing of the piece, I think they actually can do it without even seeing the symbol. Next one is the dots. I'm going to focus mainly on the dotted values and not on staccatos. It's frequent for a dyslexic when they're reading a text to ignore any punctuation in it. So when teaching dotted values, to my view, it's very important to explain to them the actual concept of the dotted value, that the dot adds half of the value of the note that is next to it. Otherwise, if they just learn that this dotted value is that and this one is this, every time they come across to a new one, they will have to learn and unlearn the previous one. Fingering, I sometimes see my scores having so many different numbers on. I would say add fingering numbers only when it's absolutely necessary. Otherwise, it adds extra stress to them. However, some pupils find it easier to read numbers instead of notes, especially in the beginning. I was guilty of doing that too. So if that's the case, and it does reduce their visual stress in the beginning, I would suggest to do what is written down on the bottom picture of the right side, that we have taken the notes off and kept the numbers only. but just for the beginning, just a suggestion. Last one, tracking, especially for pianists. Sorry if that's not relevant to you, because we have to track 2 staves as well as track vertically on the keyboard and the keys. And that's hard for any piano student, especially for a dyslexic piano student. I found that enlarging the score, leaving a bigger gap, as we said before, between right and left hand can help. Highlighting each system with a different color, or even just highlighting the end of one system and the beginning of the next one with a different color, that can help too. Doing any dot-to-dot exercises like the game, if you connect the notes so that they can see the shapes and how the direction of the melody on the score as well. Having many visual breaks, and for tracking specifically, we like playing the game where they catch the teacher wrong when I play, and they just have to track the score and tell me if I did something wrong, or even better, when they have to track the score and tell me where I stopped, for example, which is better for them because they don't have the stress about playing while tracking music at the same time. So far, these are some tips for notation. I'm going to go on with the motor difficulties that were discussed. As you can see on the right side of the slide, I've got some of the teacher comments as well. First one, as expected again, and one of the most popular issues addressed was the left and right hand coordination, as well as the hand and foot coordination, which is very popular in piano students. I'm sorry if that's not fully relevant to you, but on the motor ones especially, I'm going to focus on piano playing. Now, for dyslexics that do have motor problems, because not all of them do, sometimes their dyslexia might go hand in hand with dyspraxia, which refers to a difficulty in organizing movements, but that's not always the case. Our motor skills in general can be divided in gross motor skills and fine motor skills, where gross motor skills are a whole limb movement and fine motor skills involve any finger dexterity. For the gross motor skills, first, any clapping or playground games can really help in increasing control. Also, any body percussion activities can be a really good practice for them. For example, they can tap crotchets with one hand and quavers with the other hand in reverse. Additionally, any exercises that can develop arm independence can be really helpful. For example, there's a famous one where you tap your head and you have to rub your belly at the same time, or the other one that you have to raise one of your arms in front of you and the other arm on the side of your body at the same time and reverse, which can be actually quite hard for dyslexics or pupils with dyspraxia, but also they're really fun and helpful at the same time. For any hand and foot coordination issues, the first one, of course, would be any marching. Or I've seen some teachers doing some seesaw movements with the feet on the beat so that they can teach them how the pedaling works as well. Now, regarding the fine motor skills and the hand independence that has to do with the finger dexterity, there's really loads to say, and there are really loads of exercises available everywhere. For beginners, I think that the issues usually start when they have to play a melody with the right hand that they have to play on every beat mainly, and a chord for a whole bar at the left hand. It's very important, I think, for the pupil prior to this to have played pieces that the right hand plays on every beat and the left hand plays on every other beat. because if the left hand has just to play for the whole bar, it will need to mirror the right hand. So it's really important to break that down so that they play on every other beat, for example, the first and the third one. After that, we can practice playing the whole bar with the left hand, but adding a rest on the last beat so that they can have time to prepare for the chord on the next bar. For finger dexterity as well, any hand-on exercises or any similar exercises can be really helpful as well for two reasons. First, because there's mirroring in both hands do the same movement. And second, because they can be played on any different key, and they can start from different keys, either black or white keys, while keeping the text familiar for the eyes, and they can see the same shape. I sometimes ask them to practice these exercises with a bit of delay between hands without synchronizing them, so that they have to think of each hand separately without playing separate hands. Another exercise I found very helpful that is suggested by Olga Thorpe in Instrumental Teaching for Dyslexics was this one. It's called the crab walking exercise. And I find it really good, not just for finger dexterity, but also for the exploration of the geography of the keyboard, because they can play it for the whole keyboard and they can explore the low notes and the high notes as well. For playing scales, I used a similar technique as well, without synchronizing the hands together again. And I found it more useful than practicing hands separately, to be honest, because sometimes they learn right hand perfectly, they learn left hand perfectly, and then they can't put these two different pieces of knowledge together. Also, I have found that if you have a picture of the keyboard in front of them instead of the score of the scales, it can be helpful. If you add the fingering on the keys or having stickers on the black keys, the flats and the sharps that they have to play, is also more helpful than having it on a score. Generally, for any gross or fine motor skills, adding any physical reaction, any movement, any games, rhythms, rhythm flashcards, clapping, marching, skipping, based on the approaches of Dalcroze and Kodai, can significantly help in instrumental teaching as well. Now, I'm not going to get into any memory tips or sight reading, because there are huge topics as well, but I'm going to explore some of the other secondary symptoms that teachers did express. To my view, it's more important to treat the secondary symptoms before the primary ones. Most of those can easily be reduced by creating an encouraging and friendly environment and creating a nurturing relationship between the student and the teacher. Let the student know that you appreciate hard work, even if the result is not great on that day. Or find the student's strengths and make it a special thing in the beginning or in the end of its lesson. Plan based on those strengths and breaking down any new input. Also, it's very important to involve them in the process, as most of the times they know what works from them. They have some strategies already, and they can come up with really great tips about how they can recognize right and left hand, for example. They know how they cope in everyday life. Also, use a lot of praise. A dyslexic child isn't used to getting a lot of praise in the classroom, unfortunately. So every victory in a one-to-one setting has to be celebrated. Last but not least, try to teach multisensorily. That's the first tip for any literacy sessions, and it's the same one for any music lessons as well. In music education, the two approaches that are outstanding examples of multisensory teaching are, as I mentioned before, Dalcroze and Kodai. I'm not going to get into details, but I strongly recommend you to have a read as both approaches can be easily adapted into instrumental teaching. Now, going back to the actual research, it was quite disappointing in the end to see that all those teachers didn't really use any alternative resources. Most of them said that they don't. However, a big number of the ones that did, as you can see on the big chart, used the ones that were mentioned already, such as highlighters, colors, overlays, and pictures, because these were the top suggestions. That's why on the next slide I have listed some of the resources that I find quite useful to have during a lesson with a dyslexic pupil. Rhythm cards are quite easy to make by hand, but if you're interested in any graphic scorecards or anything else like that, I can upload them on the website, or I can send them to you via email if you ask me. Now, the last one, I've left the parents section in the end, not because it's not important, but because it's as important as all the previous ones. Without your support and the encouragement to musical learning, nothing could be possible at all. I think it's an undeniable fact for all of us here that music learning can help any child's development in many ways. And there's additionally a lot of research about how music can help students with dyslexia and literacy as well, but that actually could be a topic for a whole different talk. So, how can parents assist the musical learning of a dyslexic student? First of all, and the most important, if you know that your child has got dyslexia, please do share this information with the music teacher as well. Sometimes parents don't share it with us because they think that it's irrelevant, and I've seen that many times. Also, sharing any information about the student's learning profile will save a lot of time from us to find out which are their strengths and their weaknesses, because not any dyslexic have the same struggles. Secondly, if your child hasn't been assessed, but there's a teacher that teaches any subject that shares any worries with you, please do not ignore this. Remember though, an assessment has to be completed by an accredited dyslexia specialist, and only those people. Also, if there are any visual stress issues with your child, the student's eyes should be checked as soon as possible. And not only their vision, but also how the eyes function together. Another question I often hear from parents is if there is a right instrument for a dyslexic student. The answer is no. We have to take into account what the child wants and their interests, their motivation, and what instrument they like the most as well. Now, regarding the lessons, if your child is dyslexic, it's advisable to choose a teacher that is aware of the difficulties and offers a pack of alternative strategies and resources. We as teachers will definitely need your help in organizing the lesson, making sure that your child has got all the books and the instruments and the notebooks and everything. What I actually do as well, and seems to work better with dyslexic student, is to book 2 short lessons in a week rather than 1 long one. And also, I prefer to send the practice instructions to the parents by email that can actually read it, especially if the dyslexic student has got difficulties with reading as well, and adding mainly keyboard pictures on their practice diary. Last one, it's extremely important with any learning to keep our expectations realistic regarding taking any exams or public performances. There is always a high risk element in taking any practical examinations for everyone or performing in public. Everyone performs better when they're not stressed. So when applying for an exam, it's important to add that the student is dyslexic, so any adjustments will be considered. I would also recommend for beginner students to take the preliminary grade exam before taking the grade 1 exam. Taking part in performances is very important for the self-esteem, but choosing a duet for the first public performance to reduce their stress is not a bad idea at all. Now, before I finish with all the talking, this research is still ongoing. If you have any questions, recommendations, any resources that you use with your dyslexic students or your children that you would like to share with me, I'd really love to hear from you. All the tips I've shared with you are just recommendations, just some things that I found that did help me. You can either contact me via email or on the website that you can see on this slide. Some things for you to take from this session, and I'm actually happy to discuss any questions with you the best I can for the rest of the time we've got.
Thank you very much, Maria. That was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
So it seems we do already have a few questions coming up in the chat box. And so we'll just start with in the order that they've come in. The first question that's come in from Deborah is whether or not, oh sorry, actually I just realized I had missed Mark's question above, which was about what was the difference between acquired dyslexia and developmental dyslexia.
So acquired dyslexia often refers to adults that have difficulty in manipulating words or language, mainly most of the times after having a stroke or anything similar like that. Developmental dyslexia is often seen in children, and it's genetically inherited. Probably. We don't know the root yet, but it's probably genetic.
Okay, great. And the next question asked about, though there was actually a bit of general discussion about the importance of learning by ear and the Suzuki method, and whether that would be a recommendation that you had, or you know, where you feel the importance lies between reading music. There's a few questions, and learning by ear in those initial stages.
Yes, I was definitely going to talk about this. I haven't used the Suzuki method at all, especially with piano students. But learning by ear or by rote is very popular amongst dyslexics. What I think is that there are some dangers regarding this. For example, students, if they rely on ear mainly, they can learn something wrong, especially during their practice session. And then when they come back, it's really hard for them to unlearn it and start again from the beginning. So if we go following this type of learning, we can either tell them that you're not going to practice this at home, you're not going to have a score, we're only going to practice that together so that you can copy me, which is, I don't know, it doesn't really promote independence in their learning, I think. Some things are easier to learn by ear. I'm guilty of doing that too when I was younger. I found myself not reading but copying, but I found myself doing so many mistakes and skipping so many things, so that I don't know if that would be better. Most of the times with my students, I try to encourage them to find ways to learn to read as well.
Okay, yeah, thank you. It's a great perspective. We also had a question come in that says, in your opinion, from Ksenia, in your opinion, in what way do you think trainee teachers should be introduced to dyslexia by teacher training providers during their training?
I think that the best way is to have a look at the different interventions that are happening, because there are many specifically designed programs for dyslexia. For example, the box spelling program or the listening program that has got different rhythms and spellings. So when I observed a specialist, a dyslexia specialist doing this, I kind of understood how dyslexics learn better. So any theoretical information, any practical information is better than just giving information about what dyslexia is. I don't know if that, am I clear enough?
Well, that you think that it's about not just saying, oh, this is what it is, but saying how do you address that in the classroom. And
Exactly.
yeah, no, I think that makes sense. We have a question from Ivan. Do you think dyslexia can affect learning improvisation on a given instrument?
I think, in my experience, it really didn't. And that was the way I went forward with sight reading as well. I most of the times don't show them any sight reading pieces at all. I show them rhythm flashcards, and we do clapping games with them. Then I introduce a key, so we can sight read with different flashcards, one next to each other on a given key. Then I introduce some sharps and some flats that we can meet on that scale. And we do simple 4-bar improvisations on those. And after that, I give them a 4-bar sight reading piece. So I think that improvisation can help any learning, either if it's learning a new music piece or if it's learning sight reading.
That's actually really interesting, because it also we'd had Katie had highlighted that sight reading seemed to be essential for a lot of musicians in their career, and so how was that affecting? So I think that linked in very nicely.
I'm a terrible sight reader myself as well, so I found that this type of learning how to sight read has helped me too. Also, for beginner students, if we're talking about sight reading, I found that the envelope window that I talked before, when hiding what has already been played, has really helped them a lot. It does reduce the visual stress of sight reading a lot.
Yeah, that's very useful. And we have a question from Juanita, which is there any online program or website through which tutors can teach dyslexic kids online?
Honestly, it did come up on the research as well that many piano teachers do use different apps and websites, but I haven't used any, unfortunately.
So perhaps they need to do a little bit of their own research in terms of where to find that.
I'm not really great at technology, to be honest, so I haven't really explored that yet.
But well, you've done a wonderful job this evening. You'd never know that there was any any aversion to technology on the side. Okay, do we have any other questions? Either you could type them in the chat box, or also feel free to unmute your mic and ask directly if you prefer to do that as well. Any final questions? Well, I have one for you, Maria. If there's one thing that you would like teachers or parents to take away from today, what would that be?
It would be teaching on the students' strengths, because not all dyslexics are the same. Some dyslexics might have really strong oral memory. Some others can be really strong at improvisation. There are a lot of different options for exams as well. So for example, for Trinity College exams, they don't really need to sit for sight reading, they can do improvisation now. So do teach them on what they find easier and give them a little bit of new input every time, break that down.
Okay, excellent. And then final question there from Despina, which is how could we have access to the materials that you've suggested in your presentation for helping students learn?
Great. They're all available on my website, pianoandmore.com. But if you've got any other resources, if you would like me to give you any other of those resources mentioned, you can write me an email. I can scan them for you.
All right, perfect. Okay, so I think with that we are perfectly come to the end of our hour, and so we'll wrap up there. And so just a word to everyone, you should receive a feedback form via email from us at Bell House, and we'd really love if you take 2 minutes to fill in the survey just to tell us a little bit about how you found this evening. It really helps us to keep improving, and it'll help Maria as well to know how you all found this evening. So it would be really great if you take the time to fill that in. And if you aren't already on the Bell House mailing list, please go to our website and join the mailing list there. It's a great way to keep in touch with our other talks on dyslexia and our and other areas as well. And in fact, on the dyslexia side, we have recently started offering free dyslexia advice sessions that can be 15-minute sessions with a dyslexia specialist. Submit your question in advance and they'll target their advice to in that 15-minute session with you. We have the next set coming up this Friday from 9:30 to 11:30 a.m. And so if you would like to sign up to one of those sessions, you can find the link on our website under events, and then you can just fill in the little Google form there to sign up for that. And then also just looking a little ahead, on the 3rd of June, we have a talk by Dr. Susie Nyman, who is a major proponent of multisensory teaching. She's celebrating 25 years of multisensory teaching in a talk with us. And so if you would be interested in learning more about how that can support dyslexic learners, please join us for that talk. And so lastly, I'd just like to say thank you very much, Maria. Thank you for giving your time to Bell House. We very much appreciate you joining us this evening. And thank you very much to everyone who's come along tonight. Thank you for your questions and your participation.
Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Good evening.